So to close out our final session of INN at Home, I want to tell you a little bit about our next speaker, Julie Sandor. Prior to her appointment as president of the Charles H. Revson Foundation in 2008, Julie had a very successful career in helping provide solutions to chronic homelessness. She was president for the Corporation for Supportive Housing, program director at the Local Initiatives Support Corporation, which is building public-private partnerships in urban revitalization, particularly in low-income housing and nursing homes. She co-founded Next Book, a national organization dedicated to promoting and creating Jewish literature, culture, and the arts. So please join me in welcoming Julie Sandorf as she proposes why funders in a variety of fields should consider supporting journalism and how to bypass those disheartening words, "We don't fund journalism," in her closing remarks, establishing the value of news in every field. Please join me in welcoming Julie Sandor.
Fran. Thank you, Fran. I know I'm the last person standing between all of you and a much needed and well-deserved break from Zoom, and I really want to thank you for joining the conversation. I also want to thank INN, Sue Cross, Fran, and the whole team for the amazing efforts you've made in transferring this huge conference to a virtual conference. So, if there was ever a time to make the strongest possible case for philanthropic funding for mission-driven journalism, the evidence couldn't be clearer and the argument couldn't be more straightforward than now. In the absence of a vaccine, information is the best medicine. And in the absence of honest and straightforward answers and accountability from police departments, City Hall, the State House, and the White House, journalists have been the essential first responders. You've been setting the record straight about what's going on across the street, across town, and across the country. You have been insisting on the truth, holding those in power accountable for their actions and their inactions. You've risked your own health and welfare to defend the public interest. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Sorry. That's all you need at the end of the day. Okay. Let me just go back a minute. You guys have risked your own health and welfare to defend the public interest. The social, economic, and racial injustices exposed by the pandemic and the horrific murders of Black Americans by the hands of local police have also forced a reckoning in newsrooms across the country about who decides what is news, how it is reported, and who does the reporting. And that makes even clearer the case for nonprofit mission-driven journalism that is driven first and foremost by service to the community. And in this crowd, I definitely don't need to go into chapter and verse about how the economy's free fall has accelerated the financial woes of local commercial news industry. It is a crippling body blow to local news at a time when the need for local public service journalism couldn't be more crucial. I speak from lived experience as a parochial New Yorker, and I can say with the confidence that absent local news reporting, especially from public and nonprofit media sources here, we would have been left in the dark about the impact of the pandemic, the machinations of the New York City Police Department, and the integrity and compassion and peace-seeking of those who took to the streets in protest. Nobody else would have told us the truth about the dire situation in nursing homes, homeless shelters, and our local hospitals, Quite frankly, no one in authority was telling us about the rates of infection, hotspots, hospitalizations, and deaths during the first few weeks of the pandemic here in New York. We relied on local journalists to give us that information, to push back on the mixed messages, the petty bickering, and the misinformation. When the market can't provide an essential public service, philanthropy has historically stepped in as the loss leader, helping to build a new industry, often in partnership with civic leaders and sometimes even the public sector, to create new ways to fill this gap. So, how do we make the case for philanthropic investment, both individual, foundations, and community investment, for building and strengthening the mission-driven nonprofit news industry? And I'd argue with foundations, there is a step one, and all of you are the key leaders in a critically needed education process. The marketplace has changed so rapidly. What was a public service cross-subsidized by ad revenue is truly at risk of extinction. And even in its heyday, commercial local news did not always equally represent, reflect, or amplifying pressing issues, especially in lower income and minority communities. Journalism as a public service is an equity issue. Funders who say they don't fund journalism need a better understanding of the links between journalism, equity, civic engagement, and their own missions. And you are charged with being those educators. There is an inextricable link between the mission and role of journalism and the advancement of philanthropic mission. Foundations simply cannot afford to fund journalism, cannot afford to not fund journalism as a tool to advance their missions. How does the foundation advance positive change in any number of issues? Public health and healthcare, education, social services, workforce development, criminal justice, housing, economic development, without the press to amplify those issues in the public mind and hold accountable those making decisions about these issues? Can a foundation that cares about the health of the elderly not support reporting on nursing homes? Journalism is an incredibly powerful lever for influencing public opinion and spurring change. If a foundation funds youth development, yet it doesn't fund journalism that spotlights budget cuts in youth services, they are so hampered in furthering their mission. How does a foundation tackle civic engagement, voter participation, and community building without an informed citizenry that has trusted sources of information? For foundations interested in bridging racial, economic, and geographic divides, local journalism is an unbelievably powerful tool to create common ground and common knowledge about lived experiences other than one's own. Who else is going to be the eyes on the streets to tell the stories of individuals and communities that are too often rendered voiceless? Our ignorance of the bigger picture makes us more divided. Our knowledge and understanding of others' lived experiences unites us. Nonprofit, mission-driven journalism is a central tool in that arsenal of trust building. And any foundation that invests in policy or advocacy and how public resources are distributed and used has a vested interest in supporting journalism that follows and reports on public and private expenditures and budget decisions. Without somebody watching, corruption goes unchecked. Institutions that affect our everyday life are not held to account. And most importantly, precious resources, our taxpayer dollars, may not reach its intended beneficiaries. Without local journalism, how would the public know that City Hall has eliminated all funding for summer youth employment programs while cutting the New York City Police Department's budget by less than 1%? I don't think we're going to get that information from a mayor's press release. Step 2 in the education process, addressing the impact dilemma. Funders say they have difficulty funding journalism because they can't measure the impact of these investments. It is incumbent upon us to prove them wrong. An essential element in making the case is putting together the evidence that these investments do make a difference. While there is no one single indicator, there are actually a collection of data points from which your story can be told. I'd say, and none of them require incredible levels of sophistication. The first is tracking your stories for responses, official responses, changes in policy, legislative changes, and changes in basic quality of life issues. Was that street sign fixed? Was that playground opened? Those are very meaningful to the people who live in those communities. Secondly, your traffic, your monthly unique visitors. It's not just the numbers, but who is reading? Do your readers represent a wide cross-section of stakeholders in the community? Are elected officials daily readers, policymakers? Who from underrepresented communities are reading your news site? That is a very big issue of impact. Thirdly, the amplification of your stories. How many of your stories are republished? How many of them gone viral on social media? How many of your stories are the origin stories that larger outlets use to do follow-up stories? That's impact. And then engagement, which is really your value add. Evidence of outcomes of community engagement not only show the impact of your work, but it just makes for better journalism, trust building, and relationships with trusted sources. And I just want to cite two recent examples in New York from the city. In May, the city put a call out to New Yorkers to submit stories about individuals who had died as a result of COVID-19, to create a place to commemorate and memorialize and valorize all the lives that are lost, that have been lost. Over 1,000 stories have been collected to date, and the response has been phenomenal. Another example from the past 2 months, the city has asked readers to report on allegations of unlawful conduct by the police and by protesters. It has yielded huge responses and important information, not only to share with the public, but has built trust among sources in the community to share information that would never otherwise have been available to the public. And then lastly, how do you measure your impact? Your base of support. And it's not just financial support. It's membership, donations, the number of tips that you get, the elected officials and community leaders and activists who will publicly endorse the work you're doing. Showing why what you're doing matters to the community is impact. And I'd say step 3 is thinking as broadly as possible about what constitutes philanthropy in your community. Individual contributions in local journalism at the end of the day is what's going to save us, not foundation money. And one way to show value is fundamental service journalism, providing valuable information to the public that they need to navigate their everyday lives. Applying for unemployment insurance in this current time, where to get tested. Another example from the city in New York was they created a coronavirus tracker very early in the pandemic when you could not access any reliable information about the spread of the disease, hospitalizations, hotspots in neighborhoods. We just couldn't get it from public sources, and they created that. And highlight this virtuous cycle to funders. Proof of value to the community is evidenced by donations, memberships, tips, community engagement, which in turn makes for better journalism, which in turn makes for stronger support. There is a real virtuous cycle going on here. And the most sustaining social change that I have known in my entire adult life, and certainly as we've seen in the last few weeks, is local, 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 from the bottom up. Local champions are essential. Are there civic leaders, business leaders, community leaders, activists, and yes, elected officials who will champion what you're doing and make the case to your local foundations? And then I'd say lastly, you are the change. You are the lost leaders, and you are leading by example. According to the hot off the press 2020 INN Index, the field of nonprofit journalism is growing. It is the bright spot, and it is leading the way forward. And as a member of the public who benefits from this essential public service, I personally want to offer my gratitude for all that you're doing to keep us safe and sound. I wish you all continued strength, courage, success, safety, and good health. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you very much for that inspiring talk about journalism and foundation support. It's wonderful. We do have a few questions that have come up in the chat. And I think that one in particular seems to be getting a lot of attention. Should city, counties, or states not be the largest contributors to fundamental journalism? What is the government role, I think, in supporting journalism?
Well, it's not all that. First of all, there has been a very long history of government support of local journalism. Just look at the back of any newspaper's legal notices. That is public support of local journalism. There is a very, I think it is part of the mix. And I think that just as you don't want foundations influencing what you're writing and who you're covering, you can have the same firewall with government funding. Public media has proven that. In New York, there is a very interesting new initiative that Revson is supporting called the Boost Advertising Initiative that's being run by the Center for Community Media at the Newmark Journalism School. Mayor de Blasio, about 2 years ago, had an executive order whereby 50% of all of New York City's ad spending was to be dedicated to the community media, the community and ethnic media in New York. CCM is actually working to make sure that that order gets implemented. It was launched in January, and 82 community media outlets in New York, and these are very local neighborhood news outlets, have received funding for the city, and about 30 of them had never received a dime in city ad revenue before. So I think it is entirely possible. I think it is part of the ultimate goal of having as broadly diverse revenue sources as possible, because that's how you sustain your independence.
Thank you, Julie. That's also insightful and helpful. I have a question here from Libby Pattison about what do you consider to be the, other than just readership, traffic to your site, and money raised, are foundations open to the strength of relationships, for example, as well, to know about that as a kind of metric for success?
I think foundations are not well educated about any of this. And I think you have to make that a metric of success. Foundations that are funding community building and civic engagement look at those relationships as a metric for success. Why wouldn't you also include it as a metric for success in the work you're doing? It is part and parcel and core to the mission of community building. So they may not understand that is a metric. You provide the great data that shows that it is a metric. We're in the nascent stages of all this now, and we can define with rigor what those metrics are.
Oh, that's great. That's very important to hear. And also, I'm wondering if you could give us a little personal how Revson moved a little bit more in the journalism direction, supporting nonprofit journalism. What is it, if you can share with us, what arguments you made with the board of directors or the people at Revson to make sure that journalism was on the table for support?
Sure. The foundation, we are a foundation based in New York, and we're relatively small foundation. We have a long history in funding media, not as long a history in funding journalism, because until 12 or 15 years ago, journalism was a pretty strong commercial operation. We did a little bit of funding in that area, but not a lot. In 2008, when I got to the foundation, I noticed something strange going on in New York. The New York Times Metro section folded into its national section. The New York Sun folded completely. El Diario was on its last legs, and it was the kind of canary in the coal mine of what was to come. And I started looking at this question of what happens to our city, our communities, when there is not strong local reporting here. And I think that our board had been with me all along from this. This was an education process for our board. But as the reporting on the commercial side continued to diminish in New York, I'm very nervous about the two big tabloids in this town as well, given the free fall of advertising revenues. It became much clearer that a nonprofit, mission-driven journalism that would rely on a whole range of sources was the way to go. And we have in New York supported not just the creation of new journalism outlets, we've supported public media, and we support scholarships at the Newmark Journalism School for minority and first generation journalism students. We look at the whole infrastructure of what is needed to support robust nonprofit journalism. We just made a grant. We just made an investment in the funding of the Cornell local journalism legal clinic to provide legal support to nonprofit local news operations all over the New York metro area. And so it's, for us, for this foundation, which has a long history in civic education and holding government accountable, the idea that we did not have that tool in New York, or it was greatly diminishing, was just a natural next step for us.
That's great. And I have a follow-up question, sort of on the same line, from Chris Kane. Great presentation. I wonder whether you have a sense of whether foundation leaders in other cities are open to the idea of funding journalism. And I would add, how do we get there? Or if you can suggest ways of getting those foundations more into the journalism space.
Right. I have gotten a number of calls from foundations around the country saying, how are you doing what you're doing, and how can we do what you're doing? I've actually written something about that. It's on the Revson Foundation website in my president's letter. Basically, how did we as a foundation help found the city, and what did it take, and who did it involve in the community to do that? I mean, I think that it depends on the community. And I'm more than willing to talk to anybody about this, any funder about this. But, it's really important to find local champions who have the respect and credibility in the community to also to make your case for you and with you. And everybody, I'm hoping that all communities still have their civic leadership. Create relationships with those folks. Create relationships with community leaders who can make the case to their community foundations that without this resource, their voices aren't heard. And we have a big education process.
I think that's true. And it's an education process that, Julie, we are very thankful that you are on the forefront of, because I think it really speaks volumes when you can speak to another funder and say, this is important in communities and local communities and even nationally. I think it's a wonderful thing that you are taking this position, and that you could become the proponent for the foundation community on some level to support journalism, nonprofit journalism.
And I am far from being alone. I mean, at the national level, the Knight Foundation, the Democracy Fund, the Emerson Collective, I mean, there are ever increasing number of foundations who see the role of nonprofit journalism as the linchpin to everything else going on that will save our democracy. I am far from being alone in this. There are some wonderful philanthropic leaders, and we just have to keep pounding the pavement.
That's true. It's very true. And absolutely, they're national leaders, and I think people might be more concerned about how to engage their local leadership,
right,
and community foundations and the support from foundations of cities and counties.
Right.
And that's a longer process.
Right. And I mean, in smaller communities, your local chamber of commerce needs the local news. Your Rotaries need the local news. Think about the people who rely on your local news operation, and create those relationships with them. It doesn't, and they have relationships with other civic leaders and local foundations. It is an ever expanding series of relationships, but think about the people who depend on your getting the word out. And it could be the local chamber of commerce is your best friend, or could be your best friend.
Thank you, Julie, very much for closing this conference with such inspiration and such leadership. We really, really appreciate it.